right. Well, feel like I'm ready to start recording. Got my camera set up, got my light, I've got my microphone, got the uniform on, got the hat. I've got all the things I need, but I really feel like there's something that I'm forgetting to do. Oh, Okay, well, now that that's out of the way, let's talk a little bit about beards in the 18th century. So as you may have gathered from that opening sketch, beards, in the context of 18th century reenacting, are something of a contentious issue. And the thing is, they really should not be. It's generally understood by most people who study the period, I think, that the 18th century as a whole is profoundly anti-beard, more so than possibly any other era in history, and there is ample evidence to support this. To be emphatically clear, beards in the 18th century were not a thing, at least not in the modern context that we view them today. Yet, every time somebody calls attention to this, like moths to a flame, people will come out of the woodwork spouting nonsense pseudo-justifications for why they think they should be allowed to keep their beards when portraying an 18th century person. And I'm here today to go over some of those supposed justifications and prove, hopefully, once and for all, why they're wrong. But in order to do that, we first need to wind the clock back a bit further in order to understand what made beards in the 18th century so unpopular in the first place, because that wasn't always the case. If you look at pictorial evidence from the mid to tail end of the 17th century, for example, you'll see plenty of examples of men being depicted with beards. And then, as you progress nearer to the turn of the century and cross over into the 1700s, the 18th century, there's a sudden and noticeable shift. So what happened? Well, the short answer is the Enlightenment happened. A widespread political, scientific, philosophical, and social revolution of sorts that sought to bring forth an age of reason, wherein people would rise above the so-called barbaric ways of the past and be governed by science rather than by superstitions. The Enlightenment brought about new ideas regarding cleanliness and personal hygiene. As I've already stated in my Too Clean video, people of the Enlightenment era were very much into the idea of cleanliness. Although people in the 18th century often did not have a reliable way to obtain water with which to take full immersion baths, they did understand the importance of washing and, at the very least, maintaining clean clothing in order to preserve their health, and wash basins were a common household feature along with soap. So, 18th century people were indeed washing on a regular basis, and when I say washing, that includes shaving. During earlier time periods, such as the Renaissance, people had different ideas as to how the body got rid of waste material. And one of those ideas was that facial hair was actually a form of excrement, specifically a waste product of the testes, which was desirable at the time because it was thought of as a sign of virility and masculinity. But with the dawn of the Age of Enlightenment and its new ideas on cleanliness, it was no longer seen as desirable to be wearing a form of excrement on your face. One issue of a 1713 newspaper, Richard Steele's The Guardian, even explicitly refers to facial hair as a horrid excrescence. So, shaving became an important part of regular washing, and as such, especially when you factor in advancements in steelworking technology, which made it easier to obtain sharp, long-lasting razors, the act of wearing a beard vanished almost entirely from the public eye. To have a beard was viewed as improper, and to wear one was, in the words of Joanna Gilmore, likely to cast one into the category of eccentric, insane, or otherwise unreasoned and ungoverned. Peter the Great of Russia, in the very tail end of the 17th century, famously instituted a beard tax. It was widely unpopular, as beards were viewed in Russia as outward manifestations of the image of God, and the tax largely targeted the nobility rather than peasants. Yet, despite this, the tax persisted until 1772, when it was repealed by Catherine the Great. I bring this up because the tax was implemented by Peter as a part of a series of sweeping reforms to modernize Russia in the style of Western European ideals, taking inspiration from the Enlightenment. And if his idea of modernizing included encouraging his subjects to shave, that should be a clear indication of what the norm in the rest of Europe was at the time, and that norm was to be clean shaven. And this isn't some unverifiable crackpot theory either. We know this. Look at any portrait or sketch of any gentleman, military officer, or even a lowly commoner, and you'll find that they're almost always depicted as being clean shaven, unless they're depicted with some extenuating circumstance that would render them unable to shave. Typically, you'll see this in depictions of wounded military veterans, like this detail from a 1786 watercolor by James Gilray, which depicts a wounded sailor who has a full beard because, well, look at him. He's got no legs and no arms. There are many other such renderings, almost always depicting men who are either disabled and therefore unable to hold a razor, destitute and therefore perhaps too poor to afford one, or insane and therefore lacking the presence of mind to care about their outward appearance. So the rule of thumb is that if somebody is depicted with a beard, they are most likely either infirm, indigent, insane, or some combination of the three, with limited exception being given to people of particular religious affiliations, such as Orthodox Jews or Catholic monks. And before we go any further, I know people are going to point out specific eccentric individuals from across the 18th century who were noteworthy at least in part because they had a beard at one point or another. And they'll say, well, what about this person? They had a beard and they don't fall neatly into any of those categories. I'm just going to stop you right there and say that it doesn't matter, period. You're talking about extreme fringe case individuals who do not in any way represent the majority of people. And in reenacting, we strive to portray the ordinary, not the extraordinary. All of that to say, unless you, as a reenactor or living historian, are portraying any of the people listed above, you should be clean-shaven for your impression. And if you are portraying a soldier, this is doubly true. During the American Revolution, both sides had strict regulations on soldiers being required to shave. Esteemed military writer Bennett Cuthbertson, for example, stresses that one of the duties of the sergeants and corporals should be to ensure that the men have their beards close shaved, their hands and faces well washed, their sidearms properly put on, and that every particular about them be in the most exact order. On a similar note, a passage from a Continental Orderly book dated April 1778 states the following: "The soldier may always shave his beard, appear with clean hands and face, and in general have an air of neatness, which will be auspicious under all disadvantages." While it's not exactly clear how often soldiers were required to shave, the general rule of thumb that most historians seem to agree on is that it was roughly once every 3 days, or at minimum twice a week. Again, harkening back to the Too Clean video, there's a passage quoted within that video from Surgeon Colin Chisholm of the 71st Regiment Foot, where he states that the British Army alternated every day of marching by rest every third day, when practicable, and on top of that, the men were obliged to clean and bathe themselves every day. So we do know that they were making time for personal hygiene, and it's safe to assume on days where the Army was attending to other matters related to cleaning and bathing, that shaving was also a part of that. That being said, if you go out looking for specific references to soldiers shaving in the field, you won't find very much. But don't make the mistake of assuming that because it wasn't being written about, that it wasn't happening. The more likely reality is that it was seen as so mundane and commonplace that it was deemed not worth writing about, so it didn't get recorded, in the same way that they weren't documenting their every trip to the latrine either. Conversely, however, what soldiers from the period do make note of are the circumstances that they found themselves in, which were so dire that it rendered them unable to shave. One example of this comes from the Battle of Hubbardton, Vermont, which occurred in July of 1777. The battle, which resulted in a British victory, was followed by several days of heavy rain, and the wounded Americans who had been taken prisoner during the battle, as well as some of the wounded Crown forces, were obliged to lie in the rain for several days while they awaited transport to hospital, with little to no cover save for some hastily constructed brush shelters, which did little to aid them. John McNamara Hayes, a British Army surgeon, describes the grisly scene thusly: "I never experienced more uneasiness at seeing the wounded suffer, nor do I wish ever to be in so disagreeable a situation again. My hands imbued in blood, my face as dirty, my beard as long as a Capuchin friar, with everything filthy on me is my present situation. Note how the presence of a beard is brought up in this context to explicitly underscore the misery, hopelessness, and the downright squalor of the situation. Effectively, McNamara is saying, the situation was so bad I grew a beard. Disgusting. This passage in particular, I think, quite nicely demonstrates the mindset that 18th century people had about facial hair. It was seen as unclean. So again, to reiterate, unless you are portraying someone who is infirm, indigent, insane, or in an incredibly desperate situation, in all likelihood, you should be clean-shaven if you are portraying an 18th century person, especially if your impression is Anglo-centric, and once again, especially if you are portraying a soldier. And before we move on, I just want to make one more point to say that yes, while beards in the military are not seen, certain armies in the 18th century did make special accommodations for some facial hair in the form of mustaches. A number of paintings done by David Maurier between 1747 and 1755, for example, depict grenadiers from various German regiments, all sporting rather impressive sets of whiskers. But notably, none of these examples are British. In fact, there's only one British soldier in all of Maurier's paintings that has anything that could remotely be considered facial hair at all, a single grenadier in the foreground of his painting depicting the Battle of Culloden, and it amounts to what could barely be called more than 5 o'clock shadow. Most likely, this is an artistic liberty taken on behalf of Maurier to help underscore the harshness of a campaign in the Scottish Highlands. It should not be taken as proof of facial hair being prominent, and should once again be looked at as the exception that proves the rule. If facial hair aside from mustaches was common amongst soldiers, we could expect to see it represented much more frequently in the pictorial record. The fact that this is the only example should speak volumes. Some might say the lack of evidence is not necessarily evidence of lack, but I have to say, at a certain point, the lack of evidence is pretty damning. But now that we've established that beards in the 18th century were uncommon, let's look at some of the evidence that is usually brought forward as a rebuttal by those who express a desire to remain bearded. One of the most common rebuttals has to do with something called runaway ads. Runaway ads, for those who don't know, are advertisements which frequently turn up in 18th century newspapers, in which somebody, usually a servant or a slave, but sometimes a deserter, has run away, as the name implies, and someone else has placed an ad in the paper offering a reward to have them found. These ads historically will include the person's name and age, accompanied by a physical description involving things like hair color and what they were wearing the last time they were seen. Sometimes these ads might include references to the runaway wearing a beard. For example, here's an excerpt from a June 28, 1775 edition of the Virginia Gazette, which begins, "Run away from the subscriber the 20th instant, May 1775. A convict servant man named George Newton, a farmer, born in Yorkshire, imported in the Justitia this spring. A stout man, about 6 feet high, much freckled, a very red beard." Now, right now you might be thinking, aha, so they did have beards. But before you get too excited, it's worth bearing in mind that in the 18th century, people generally had a very different idea of what qualifies as a beard in the first place. And while we may look at this passage and think of a beard in the modern sense, the beard that this runaway is sporting is more likely closer to what we would consider stubble or 5 o'clock shadow. So now we really start to get into the semantics side of things. Samuel Johnson's 1792 edition of A Dictionary of the English Language defines a beard simply as the hair that grows upon the lips or chin, and nearly every other dictionary from the period, whether it be from Nathan Bailey, Thomas Sheridan, or Thomas Dyke, provides a near identical definition. None of them specified that the hair needs to be of a certain length in order to qualify as a beard. Samuel Johnson's definition does, however, provide an example of the word being used in a sentence, which reads simply, "He has a long beard. He is old." So from this, we can extrapolate that unless it's specified that an individual is sporting a long beard, the term beard probably applies broadly to any visible facial hair at all, regardless of length. To further back this up, here's another runaway ad from a different issue of the Virginia Gazette, this one dated September 20th, 1776. "Deserted from my company of regulars in the 4th Battalion of Virginia Forces, the 13th of this instant, from Portsmouth. 2 soldiers, viz. John Lancaster, born in the county of Isle of Wight, 25 years old, 5 feet 9 inches high, stout made, has brown hair, a reddish beard. So this ad in particular is for a Continental Army deserter. And as previously established, we know that soldiers of this time period were required to shave at least once a week, if not twice. Note also that this ad is being published on the 20th instant of September, and the advertiser states that the individual in question went missing on the 13th of the same month, meaning that there is less than a 7-day difference between when the person deserted and the ad was placed, which means that, in all probability, his beard, as stated in the ad, is in reality probably no more than a few days' worth of stubble. All of this to say, runaway ads are not sufficient evidence for beards being widespread in the 18th century. I have been able to find little more than a handful of references to runaways wearing beards out of a sample size of literally thousands of entries across multiple publications. And even when they do appear, a majority of the time they do not refer to a full bushy beard in the modern sense, and the kind that you see many reenactors wearing. Furthermore, runaways are considered vagrants. We've already established that a majority of people in the 18th century would have been clean-shaven unless there were some extenuating circumstance that befell them which rendered them unable to do so. Vagrancy would certainly fall under that umbrella. If you're on the lam and trying to avoid authorities for whatever reason, it's understandable that you might not have the time to shave. That being said, however, not shaving just makes you stand out more, thereby increasing your chances of being detected. So, if you did have the opportunity to shave, you would certainly take it. Which brings me to the second rebuttal that you often hear, which is that shaving takes too long. Soldiers wouldn't have done it in the field. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this one because it's actually relatively easy to disprove. From start to finish, you can do it in less than 4 minutes. There's actually a video that someone from the recreated 17th Regiment of Foot made a while back, in which he goes from 5 days growth to clean-shaven in about 3 minutes and 30 seconds. Not all that much time at all. And he does all of this using minimal gear, just a strop, straight razor, and a bit of Castile soap. So it's not as if the equipment takes up a ton of real estate in your knapsack either. And we do know that soldiers in the time period were indeed carrying razors because they're a common artifact to turn up on battlefields and at campsites. Here's an example of one which is on display at the Visitor Center at the Cowpens National Battlefield. So while not everyone would have necessarily carried one, certainly enough people did that hopefully at least one person in your mess, that is, the group of people that you cook meals with and bunk with, would have one. Moving on to the next rebuttal, another one which I've not heard lately, but still often enough that I think it's worth mentioning here, is that there's a belief that pioneers in the British Army would have been allowed to have beards. And when I say pioneers, I mean sappers or combat engineers, not frontiersmen. But don't worry, that's coming up next. I think this belief stems from the fact that in the modern day British Army, you have the position of pioneer sergeant, which is one of the few positions which permits the wearing of beards. This tradition is thought to date back to at least the 19th century and possibly copied from the French, but some speculate that the tradition may go back even further. However, the little pictorial evidence we have depicting British pioneers in the 18th century does not support this. In fact, one watercolor depicting a camp scene shows a British soldier being shaven, and the person doing the shaving is in fact a pioneer. We can see by the shovel and axe he is carrying, and he is himself clean-shaven. I don't think more needs to be said on that front. And now, finally, we arrive at the big one. The myth of the ubiquitous bearded frontiersmen. Those brave and enterprising fellows who first ventured into the wilderness territories west of the Appalachian Mountains to live off the land, who were tough as nails and didn't shave because there was no one around to tell them that they had to. This image likely comes about due to conflation with the later mountain men fur trappers of the mid to late 19th century, many of whom we do have photographs of, and at least some of them in those photographs do indeed have long, bushy beards. But these are a century removed from the time period we're discussing. There are few depictions of the early frontiersmen of the 18th century, clean-shaven or otherwise, but in the few that do exist, you will note a conspicuous lack of facial hair, even in renderings done much later on, like this rather famous painting of Daniel Boone leading settlers through the Cumberland Gap. You'll note that nobody in the painting has more than a few days' worth of stubble, And this depiction is from 1849, well after public opinion on facial hair had shifted and beards were starting to become more common again. So it seems that even then, people had an understanding that social norms of the previous century were different. What I feel that a lot of reenactors, especially those who portray frontiersmen, misunderstand is that the word frontier does not mean wilderness. The frontier refers to the border between the wilderness and civilization, and as such, these early frontiersmen were not living outside of civilization but on the edge of it, and therefore still subject to its rules. Not to mention that their goal ultimately was not to escape from civilization but to expand it. It's true that these men did have to live off the land to a degree, and would often engage in long hunts, a term from which we get the name long hunter, and it's possible and even probable that while on these months-long expeditions, hygiene practices were not so strictly observed. However, there's nothing to suggest that these practices were done away with entirely. For one, it's just basic common sense to remain as clean as possible wherever and whenever possible in order to reduce the risk of diseases like typhus. For another, a majority of these men would have been brought up in Anglo-American society and would therefore retain the Anglican sensibilities surrounding hygiene, which they were brought up around. For those of you who shave regularly in the current day, think of that uncomfortable feeling you get when you haven't shaved for a few days and that prickly stubble starts to grow back in. Now imagine that you've been raised in a society that constantly tells you that facial hair is barbaric and unclean. When that prickly stubble starts to grow in, it's going to make you feel gross, and you'll probably feel a tremendous amount of pressure to shave it as soon as possible. Habits like that die hard, and if somehow you're able to overcome that and let your beard grow, and you come back from a successful hunt with lots of furs and pelts to trade, nobody in town is going to want to buy from you if you look like a raving lunatic, which you certainly will to the townsfolk if you show up with the full beard. And even if we decide to ignore all of that and hold to the idea that frontiersmen didn't shave when there weren't people around, well, if you're at a reenactment, guess what? There's people around. So you should probably shave. It's just strange to me that out of all of the things that reenactors can do that are blatantly incorrect, this is the one thing that seems to get the least amount of pushback. Now, up north, where I'm from, it's not so bad, because a lot of event organizers here do have very strict standards on shaving. At Minuteman National Park, for example, if you show up to Battle Road sporting a full beard, you will not be permitted to participate in the event unless you agree to shave on the spot. But this isn't the case everywhere, especially down south, for whatever reason. Maybe the myth of the bearded mountain man is just more firmly entrenched down there. In any case, if you attend an event at, say, Mount Vernon or Camden or Guilford Courthouse, for example, you're far more likely to encounter more than your fair share of individuals with beards. Which again, I have to reiterate, is just immensely strange to me. It's like if you went to a World War II event wearing a fully accurate GI kit, but then decided to turn out with the full beard and a ponytail. It'd be no more acceptable and no less distracting in that time period. So why does the 18th century seemingly get a pass? The answer, I think, largely boils down to apathy. Once confronted with hard evidence and all other excuses have been thoroughly debunked, the only card that these individuals have left to play is that they simply don't feel like shaving. Which begs the question of, if they're not willing to do something as simple as shaving to improve their impression, which takes virtually no time and costs no money at all to do, what exactly is it that these people are trying to get out of the hobby? I can understand not wanting to shave, believe me. I don't like to do it either, but I suck it up and I do it anyway before events because the nice thing about beards is that they always grow back, and it's a small price to pay for the sake of being more accurate for a 2-day event. If you don't want to shave, that's ultimately your choice. It's just a hobby after all. Nobody is forcing you to do anything. Just understand that by not shaving, you are hampering yourself from achieving what might otherwise be a very solid and accurate impression. At the very least, if you aren't going to shave, please acknowledge that beards weren't common or accepted in the period, and don't try to justify it by claiming otherwise. To do that is dishonest and says to me that you only care about the hobby in as much as it provides you with an excuse to drink beer and shoot guns, because clearly representing history accurately is not a priority for you. And I know at least one person is going to say, well, nothing's ever going to be 100% accurate. I know that. I'm not asking for people to be 100% accurate. That's not obtainable. and I'd be a fool to act like it is. What I am asking, ultimately, is for people to at least act like they give a shit. So to that end, shave. Just shave. It was easy to do back then. It's even easier now. There's no excuse. And with that, I am going to conclude today's video. Thank you for watching. I do hope you enjoyed. If you didn't, feel free to leave your hot takes about why I'm wrong in the comments below so that in another 8 months I can come back with a follow-up video to make you even angrier. But until then, have a good one, and as always, God save the king.